Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to take you on a journey, not through numbers, not through headlines, but through questions that will challenge the way you see truth and illusion. You see, in life and in business, what people say is often very different from what they actually do. Promises are easy, action is difficult. And when we look at the story of Gaza, this difference becomes even more important. When you hear the phrase, Israel is leaving Gaza, it sounds like hope. Sounds like peace, it sounds like change. But have you ever asked yourself, is it really leaving? Or is it just another way of creating an image for the world? Many times in history, people have been told stories that look like freedom, but felt like control. This is where we must open our eyes, because illusions are dangerous. They make you believe something has changed when in reality nothing has. I want you to imagine this speech not as a lecture but as a conversation with your own curiosity. Every point we will explore today, whether it's history, strategy, or the humanitarian cause, will help us separate reality from illusion. Because only when we see clearly, only when we understand deeply, can we truly know what is happening and what it means for the future. Stay with me until the end, because what we are about to uncover is not just about politics, it's about human dignity, about truth, and about how easily the world can be distracted by appearances. If you remain engaged, I promise you will walk away with a sharper mind and a stronger sense of what real peace should look like. The announcement of Israel leaving Gaza instantly created waves across the international media and political circles, sparking both hope and skepticism. At first glance, it seemed like a bold step toward reducing tensions in one of the most volatile regions of the world. Yet, when one looks beyond the headlines, the gap between the declaration and the practical reality becomes clear. The words Israel leaves Gaza sound decisive, but the deeper question is whether this represents a genuine disengagement or simply another layer in a carefully crafted political narrative. Such announcements in international politics are rarely simple. They are often loaded with strategic messaging aimed at audiences both inside and outside the country. For some, it was a move to appear as a nation seeking peace, while for others, it looked like an attempt to shift responsibility for Gaza's future without truly loosening control. This divergence between appearance and reality is not new in the Israeli-Palestinian context. Whenever announcements of withdrawal or ceasefire are made, they carry a symbolic weight intended to signal progress. However, the true test lies in how much the people on the ground actually feel the difference. Leaving Gaza in name may not mean leaving in practice if surveillance, air dominance, and economic restrictions remain intact. A declaration without real implementation risks being no more than a public relations exercise designed to win international sympathy while maintaining leverage in the region. Another layer of complexity arises when considering the timing and framing of such announcements. Leaders often use the language of disengagement during moments of heightened global attention, knowing that headlines travel faster than nuanced realities. If troops move back a few kilometers, but drones, border controls, and economic blockades continue, has anything fundamentally changed? The answer depends on whether one defines leaving as removing boots from the ground or genuinely ending influence over the territory. For the international community, particularly in Europe, the phrasing of such declarations demands critical examination. It is not enough to hear that Gaza is being left. The real question is what mechanisms remain in place that still restrict its autonomy. Without clarity on this distinction, the announcement becomes less about transformation and more about optics. It reassures some observers while leaving those living in Gaza to deal with the unchanged realities of restriction and dependency. The declaration might generate temporary optimism, but unless followed by substantive change, it risks being perceived as an illusion carefully designed to manage perception rather than alter facts on the ground. When discussing the notion of Israel leaving Gaza, it becomes necessity to revisit history because the past holds patterns that help us understand the present. Israel has previously declared withdrawals from Gaza, most notably in 2005 when it announced a unilateral disengagement plan. Back then, settlers were evacuated and military installations were removed, creating the impression of a complete exit. International media portrayed it as a groundbreaking step, one that could potentially open the door to lasting peace. Yet, what followed was far from the image painted at the time. Despite the removal of physical presence on the ground, Israel retained control over Gaza's airspace, territorial waters, and border crossings, effectively limiting the sovereignty of the territory. This historical precedent is vital when analyzing today's declarations because it highlights a recurring theme: departure in form, but not necessarily in substance. These past events shape the skepticism with which new announcements are received. People remember that even after the disengagement, Israel maintained the ability to control the flow of goods, restrict movement of people, and influence the region through military operations whenever it deemed necessary. For Gaza's residents, the promise of liberation quickly felt like an illusion, as everyday life continued to be dictated by restrictions and external authority. That historical memory cast a shadow on any fresh claim of leaving, making it hard for observers to accept such news at face value. Looking deeper, the historical context also reveals that each so-called withdrawal has been followed by some form of re-entry, whether through direct military campaigns or covert influence. The cyclical nature of this engagement, withdrawal, control from a distance, and return when tensions rise, suggests that the term leaving has always been conditional. It was never about a permanent handover of control, but about redefining the terms of influence. When seen from this lens, any new announcement today is less of a fresh start and more of a continuation of a long-established pattern. This context matters not only for Palestinians, but also for the wider world trying to interpret developments. International observers who celebrate the surface-level narrative often overlook the lessons of the past, thereby allowing history to repeat itself. For those who have lived through the consequences, the memory of 2005 and subsequent years remains a reminder that declarations of exit must always be tested against actions on the ground. Only then can one determine whether the rhetoric of leaving is truly a turning point or simply another chapter in a long cycle of temporary disengagement and continued control. When analyzing whether Israel has truly left Gaza, one cannot ignore the underlying strategic interests that shape every move in this conflict. Even if the announcement of withdrawal appears decisive, the question remains, what incentives or security calculations are influencing such a decision? Israel has long emphasized its need to maintain control over areas it views as vital for its national security, and Gaza is no exception. Although the territory itself is small and impoverished, its geographic position makes it strategically significant, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea and bordering both Egypt and Israel. Gaza represents both a vulnerability and a lever of influence. For Israel, stepping back physically may ease international criticism, but ensuring that Gaza does not become a base for hostility remains central to its policy. Strategic interests are not confined to military concerns alone. Control over borders and the ability to monitor the flow of goods and people represent forms of power that extend beyond physical presence. If Israel retains the authority to decide who and what can enter or exit Gaza, then its grip on the region remains strong, even without soldiers stationed inside. Such control allows Israel to prevent the inflow of weapons, but also gives it leverage in negotiations, as it can tighten or ease restrictions depending on political circumstances. This indirect control is often less visible to outsiders, but profoundly felt by those living inside Gaza. Furthermore, strategic interests include the management of resources, access to fishing waters in the Mediterranean, control over electricity supplies, and regulation of imports such as fuel or medical supplies are levers that can be used to exert pressure or maintain influence without direct governance. From a strategic standpoint, these forms of control allow Israel to claim disengagement while still safeguarding its security and political objectives. It is a calculated balance between reducing the cost of occupation and retaining the benefits of oversight. Another important factor lies in the broader regional dynamics. Announcing a withdrawal can serve to calm international allies or deflect diplomatic pressure while still ensuring that the underlying interests remain protected. In this way, Israel maintains its strategic posture without appearing to the world as an occupying force. Yet, for those directly affected, the reality is that the shadow of Israeli influence still lingers, whether through military surveillance, border restrictions, or economic dependency. Thus, the essence of the issue lies not in whether Israel physically leaves Gaza, but in whether its strategic interests continue to define the limits of Gaza's autonomy. For the people of Gaza, announcements of withdrawal or disengagement carry consequences that go far beyond political symbolism. They directly shape daily existence. When Israel declares that it is leaving Gaza, the question that immediately arises for residents is whether this translates into real relief from hardship or whether it is simply a reshuffling of control. The humanitarian perspective looks at this issue not through the lens of military strategy or international diplomacy, but through the lived reality of ordinary families. If borders remain sealed, movement restricted, and goods tightly monitored, then the supposed departure does little to improve conditions. For a population already burdened with limited access to electricity, water, healthcare, and employment opportunities, the difference between genuine independence and a symbolic announcement is enormous. The humanitarian cost of restricted autonomy has been profound. Even after previous declarations of withdrawal, Gaza's residents continue to face shortages of essential goods, restrictions on medical evacuations, and disruptions in education and employment. For children growing up in such an environment, the idea of freedom remains abstract, while their daily lives are defined by scarcity and uncertainty. This gap between political rhetoric and humanitarian reality often fosters disillusionment as people feel trapped between promises of change and the persistence of suffering. Announcements without implementation risk deepening this sense of despair, making the humanitarian perspective essential to evaluating the truth of any withdrawal. Equally important is the psychological impact. For years, the people of Gaza have heard repeated statements about peace, withdrawal, or disengagement, only to find that little has changed on the ground. This cycle creates a sense of skepticism and emotional exhaustion, where hope is sparked momentarily but quickly extinguished when conditions remain the same. For families who have lost loved ones or those struggling to survive in overcrowded and under-resourced conditions, these declarations can feel like illusions, crafted for external audiences rather than meaningful steps toward relief. Well, from a humanitarian point of view, real independence means more than an absence of foreign troops. It requires sovereignty over resources, freedom of movement, and the ability to build a functioning economy and healthcare system. Without these, the announcement of leaving has no tangible benefit for the population. What matters most is whether people in Gaza can wake up the next day with greater dignity, stability, and opportunity. For them, the true measure of change lies not in official statements, but in whether their children can live without constant fear and deprivation. When Israel announced its withdrawal from Gaza, the international stage immediately reacts, often with headlines that highlight progress toward peace. Yet much of this response is shaped by optics rather than substance. Governments, especially in Europe and North America, are eager to promote narratives that suggest conflict resolution, as these stories reinforce the idea that diplomatic efforts are working. For Israel, such announcements can be a powerful tool to soften international criticism, especially at times when its actions are under scrutiny. By presenting itself as a nation willing to step back, it projects an image of responsibility and peace-seeking, even if the reality on the ground tells a different story. This plays well in the sphere of global diplomacy, where perception often carries as much weight as reality. The politics of image-making cannot be underestimated. In international relations, it is not only what a country does, but how it communicates those actions that matters. Announcing a withdrawal sends a message to allies, adversaries, and neutral observers alike. To allies, it signals a willingness to compromise and move towards stability. To critics, it provides a counter-argument against accusations of occupation. To the broader public, it suggests that progress is being made, even if such progress is fragile or incomplete. This careful balancing act allows Israel to manage diplomatic relationships while continuing to preserve its strategic interests in the region. At the same time, these announcements serve as instruments of negotiation. By stating that it is leaving Gaza, Israel can place responsibility for future events squarely on Palestinian leadership or on Hamas, thereby shifting the international conversation. If violence escalates later, Israel can claim that it had withdrawn in good faith and that the blame lies elsewhere. This tactic strengthens its position in international forums, as it portrays itself as having made concessions while its opponents are seen as resisting peace. The global political optics also affect how aid, investments, and foreign policy decisions are shaped. Donor nations eager to support peace processes may interpret a withdrawal as a signal to increase support for Gaza, even if the practical situation has not changed significantly. This demonstrates how international perception can be manipulated to achieve broader goals, regardless of the reality on the ground. In the end, the announcements often generate more momentum in the global conversation than they do in the lives of ordinary Gazans, underlining the gap between diplomacy's optics and the region's lived experience. The concept of Israel leaving Gaza is often presented as a step toward autonomy for Palestinians, but autonomy is only meaningful when it comes with a full package of sovereignty. If Gaza continues to function under external restrictions, whether through border control, airspace, dominance, or economic blockade, then what is granted is not true independence, but rather the illusion of it. From the outside, it may appear that Israel has stepped back, yet the strings of influence remain firmly attached. This creates a situation where Gaza is labeled self-governing, but in practice, its ability to operate as a free and independent entity is severely compromised. Such illusions are powerful because they shape narratives globally, but for those living inside Gaza, they expose the gap between the promise of independence and the persistent reality of dependence. True sovereignty requires freedom of movement, control over resources, and the right to engage with the world on equal terms. Without these, Gaza's autonomy remains symbolic, confined to internal administration without the ability to shape its own destiny. This illusion is particularly evident in the way international actors sometimes celebrate announcements of withdrawal without scrutinizing what actually changes on the ground. A territory cannot be considered independent if its imports, exports, and even medical supplies depend on the approval of an external authority. For Gazans, this illusion translates into daily struggles where survival depends on navigating restrictions that contradict the very idea of freedom. Moreover, this illusion creates a dangerous cycle of expectations and disappointments. Each time a declaration is made, hopes rise that life may finally improve, that people may travel freely, that goods may enter without delay. But when the reality sets in, when the same checkpoints, shortages, and limitations continue, the disappointments. Over time, this cycle erodes trust, not only in Israel's declarations, but also in a broader international system that often validates such illusions. The disconnection between symbolic gestures and lived experiences becomes a source of frustration and disillusionment for the people most affected. The persistence of illusions also complicates the search for peace. If the world accepts symbolic disengagement as genuine progress, then the pressure to address the core issues diminishes. This allows the conflict to continue under new guise, with the appearance of autonomy masking the absence of true freedom. For lasting stability, illusions must be stripped away and replaced with tangible steps that ensure real sovereignty. Until then, Gaza's independence will remain a phrase more often spoken in political speeches than felt in the daily lives of its people. In conclusion, the announcement of Israel leaving Gaza cannot be understood by words alone. It must be measured against history, strategy, humanitarian realities, political optics, and the deeper question of sovereignty. Each perspective reveals that the difference between a true withdrawal and an illusion is not about military presence alone, but about whether the people of Gaza gain the genuine independence to live with dignity, freedom, and security. The world must look beyond headlines and examine the facts on the ground, because real peace is not created through declarations. It is created through actions that transform lives. If control remains in hidden forms, then leaving Gaza becomes a phrase without meaning, a gesture without substance. But if genuine sovereignty is granted, then it could mark the beginning of a lasting shift in one of the most complex conflicts of our time. I want to leave you with this. In every illusion, there is also an opportunity to question, to reflect, and to demand what is real. It is only when illusions are unmasked that true progress can begin. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your openness to think critically about such a sensitive issue. I wish you good luck in carrying forward these insights, and may we all continue to work toward a future built not on illusions, but on truth, justice, and genuine peace.